Hello, I'm Denene Erasmus from the Farmers Weekly. In this series that we are presenting in collaboration with the Maize Trust, we are speaking to some of the important service providers to the South African agricultural industry and specifically to the grain industries in our country. With me, I've got Wiana Louw, who's the General Manager of the South African Grain Lab. Thanks for joining us, Wiana. Just to get us started, if you can give us a quick overview of the work that the South African Grain Lab does.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. The role of the Southern African Grain Laboratory, or SAGL as we are commonly known, we were created as a laboratory to support the grain and oilseed industry when 23 years ago, when there was really a need for information on the quality of the commodities being produced in South Africa as well as what's imported. And to fulfill that function, one of our core activities is then to do crop quality surveys, which we do on all the different commodities. We do it on maize, wheat, soybean, sunflower seed and grain sorghum. And that information is then, because it's been paid for by the different agricultural trusts, that information is available to the entire value chain. So the whole purpose of the laboratory is to have the capacity and the capability to support the industry to be competitive, and that is where we focus. So if I talk about our core business, the crop surveys that we talk about, there we have an arrangement with a grain storage industry, Agbus Grain, and their members, when the samples gets harvested, and it's delivered to the storage facilities. There they take subsamples for grading purposes, and then those samples are sent through to the laboratory, and we do a whole range of different quality parameters on those. The quality parameters that we do on the different commodities is obviously different for the different commodities, but depending on the end use of it. And what we've done over the years, because we've been conducting these surveys over many years, different seasons, different regions, you have a lot of good information available. What we've done over the years also is to expand the surveys in terms of the specific quality parameters that we do. What we have to remember is the regulatory environment is constantly changing, which means what information is required for the industry to process, produce, store and process the commodities, that information change. And the laboratory need to adjust to that, which makes our life at the lab very dynamic, which is a fantastic opportunity for us to be involved there. And then added to that, we also then look at imported commodities, where we import, for example, the main imports being wheat, where we do the same range of quality analysis that we do on the locally produced. We do that on the imports as well. And then you have a good set of data to compare the quality of locally produced with imported.
How does, if we look at wheat specifically, how does the quality of the South African produced wheat compare to that of the imported wheat?
The wonderful news is very well. So it's good. The quality of what we produce in South Africa for bread baking purposes specifically is really amongst the best in the world. I know that what we import is not necessarily the best of all the countries where we import from, but what we process in South Africa, the South African wheat in terms of milling as well as baking is really amongst the best in the world, and that is the result of many years of quality analysis being conducted on the cultivars that we develop as well, because that's also part of the work that we do, is to evaluate the quality amongst a set of release criteria for wheat, to look at the quality parameters which is important for the milling and baking industry. The breeding companies have to submit their samples of the breeding lines to the laboratory on an annual basis. Those are planted, the trials are planted against a biological control. So those samples are submitted to the lab, and there's a set of release criteria with specific tolerances where this wheat is then, or the samples are analysed, and then the milling and the baking companies, representatives, as well as the breeders themselves, and we at the laboratory once a year sit then and look at that data and then make recommendations whether these lines can be advanced to a next level and eventually released for commercial production. That is the result of a process which has been running for over 20 years now that produce good quality wheat in South Africa.
So I've heard from someone that you bake very good bread at this laboratory. Could you maybe explain what's the real world impact of the work that you do and the research that you undertake? How does it affect the lives of ordinary South Africans?
What we have to understand is, and I mentioned that the evaluations that we do is for bread baking purposes specifically. Bread being one of our staple food commodities in our country, it's important that there's specific consumer requirements in terms of what you expect from a good loaf of bread. And for a milling company to mill the wheat and have a good quality wheat flour that the bread can be baked with, it's quite important that we know what we start with. So that's the in the whole chain is how it needs to be produced, what are the parameters which is important when you produce wheat to have a good quality wheat sample available to be milled. Then to optimize our milling processes to have the best possible wheat flour available for the baking industry. And then obviously the wonderful breads that we bake. As you mentioned, one of the evaluation parameters that we do in the laboratory is to physically bake breads. We do a scaled down version of a commercial bread, which is a 100-gram bread, and there's a very specific relationship between protein content and bread volume. So there are different reasons, or that's part of a set of evaluation criteria to decide, is this specific wheat sample good enough to bake a good bread, because that's what we as consumers want to buy from the shelf.
Okay. So does your the work that you do ultimately ensure good food quality and also good food safety in terms of the grain products that we have in South Africa?
So I think what the important thing here is twofold. The one is, yes, to ensure that it's safe, but also that it's good quality. In any value chain, for the chain to properly function, you need to have this proof of quality throughout the whole chain. And this is exactly the reason for the existence of the laboratory, is that we can provide that information to the industry for the chain to properly function.
And I'm sure that's not only for food, that's also in the feed industries with grains that go towards the animal feeds markets, to also test that that's of an acceptable quality.
For sure, and one of the major projects that we do with funding from the Maize Trust is to do monitoring on the mycotoxin levels. So most people are probably not even aware of mycotoxins because it's something that you can't see and it's something that you don't add, but it's a fungal growth on cereal grains that produce these toxins. And what we want to make sure is that these toxins doesn't end up in our food in the end, because they're carcinogenic, and that's why it's important worldwide. There's a huge focus on mycotoxins. So the two surveys that we do in the laboratory, one is on the post-harvest pre-storage, and then there's another one that we do where we do it post-storage pre-processing. And on that one we look at maize that's being delivered to animal feed processing plants and human food milling facilities. And then those samples are collected, submitted to the laboratory, and then we look at the mycotoxin levels of those. Also good news to say that because we keep on monitoring, we have a handle on the mycotoxin levels, because if you know what you know, you can manage. If you don't know it, you can't manage it. And that's why it's so important to keep on testing and monitoring this.
Wiana, thank you, and I look forward to visiting you to taste this lab-baked bread.
Thank you very much. You're more than welcome.